So I wanted to expose the horrible, hideous lies of Doom for years. And now that a new Doom just came out, I finally have my chance. Ladies and gentlemen, Doom is not actually a 3D game. It's a 2D top-down shooter. That's right, I said it. This game isn't 3D. You know what else? Wolfenstein 3D also isn't 3D. But Ronnie, you're saying? Just look at the game footage! That's obviously 3D! No, that game footage is a lie. A filthy, filthy lie that id Software has been perpetuating for over 20 years. And let me straighten something out right off the bat. I'm not speaking in terms of, unless you're using an Oculus or a 3DS or something, you're just staring at a 2D picture. No, what I mean is, back in the day, the hardware that these games were running on couldn't actually render 3D like this. It was technologically impossible. So how are they doing it? They aren't. This isn't actually 3D, and none of id Software's games were 3D until Quake. And they weren't the only ones lying to us. Games have been faking 3D for a very long time. Take A Link to the Past. Even though you can ascend to higher levels and jump down to lower levels, every map in-game is actually just 2D. So even though this looks like a high cliff that Link can jump down but can't climb up, everything you're looking at is actually just a flat plane. Sure, they play an animation that looks like he's jumping down, and the ground is drawn in such a way that it looks like two separate heights, but that's all a lie. It's not actually a cliff, it's just a set of tiles that are programmed so you can only traverse them one way. Downwards. And when you do traverse them, it plays a specific animation that gives the illusion of jumping. But in memory, Link isn't actually jumping from a higher place to a lower place. His Y position is just getting lower, pretty much the same way that walking up and down works. This is why enemies, like bats, who are supposed to be airborne above your head, can still be hit with your sword, because no actual Z-axis is being taken into account. This was all just clever trickery, smoke and mirrors. It was all designed to get around the limitations of the SNES. And so was Wolfenstein 3D. Even though it got an SNES release, the SNES itself is not physically capable of handling 3D this sophisticated, and in fact it's not. Just like A Link to the Past, Wolfenstein 3D isn't actually 3D. It's totally faking it. All of Wolfenstein's maps are essentially 2D maps you could sketch on a piece of graph paper. And in fact, in memory, that's exactly what the computer is calculating. A two-dimensional top-down level like this. This is the player, this is their line of sight. Every fraction of a second, the processor is taking a line and sweeping clockwise across the player's field of view, and drawing whichever wall the line hits. And it does this one column of pixels at a time. So every pixel on this 2D map in memory corresponds to a column of pixels on your screen that the processor is drawing. And depending on how long or short the line is when it hits something, determines how large or small the column of pixels on screen gets drawn, which creates the illusion of depth. If a wall is closer to the player, that means the line is short, which means the processor is going to draw larger columns. A wall farther away means a long line, which means drawing shorter columns. This process is known as raycasting. While the processor has the entire two-dimensional room stored in memory, it's only drawing whatever this beam touches within the player's line of sight. Drawing this stuff takes a ton of processing power, so you don't want to draw any more than you absolutely have to. So even though you as a player are traversing these rooms that appear to have depth, they're actually just representations of a two-dimensional room, and that 2D room is what the computer is actually processing underneath the hood. The processor is actually only looking at and computing things on this two-dimensional map. It couldn't care less what it's drawing on screen. Whatever it's drawing has no bearing on what the processor is actually calculating. When you're playing Wolfenstein, in a sense, you're actually playing a top-down shooter. This is why all the walls are the exact same height, why you don't have stairs, and why you don't see maps with more than one floor. All the maps are a single story and all the walls are the same height, because that's essentially all you can do with these 2D graph paper maps. They're very limited in a way that they wouldn't be if the processor were actually rendering 3 dimensions. This pattern indicates two-dimensional thinking. They're drawing it so it looks like 3D, but what's actually going on are calculations that are purely two-dimensional. If you know enough about technology, you can tell exactly how they're cheating by looking at their limitations. You might notice that Doom has less limitations. This has to be real 3D, right? It has stairs. Nope, Doom is cheating too, and it's cheating even more. Our first hint is that the game doesn't care how far up or down your gun is pointed, only that it sort of lines up with the enemy. See, I'm clearly shooting above this guy's head, yet all of my bullets are hitting him just fine. This isn't some avant-garde design choice. This is because the game is not actually calculating height, it's faking it. Everything, once again, is a 2D floor plan in memory, being drawn as if it's 3D. But the way Doom achieves this illusion is much more sophisticated and clever than how Wolfenstein does it. Wolfenstein is a raycaster. It shoots rays from the player and draws a column that represents whichever pixel the ray touches. sectors. What Doom does is called binary space partitioning, and it was a revolutionary idea that all shooters would use in some form or another for the next decade, and it still has applications in game engines today. When you design a level in Doom, you're designing a 2D floor plan, and when you're done with that, the Doom engine chops up your level into tinier and tinier sectors, and creates a data tree that corresponds to these different sectors. Instead of looking at an entire level, let's check out a single room. So I've designed this room. Before we can add this room to the game, the engine will chop this room in half, and chop those halves in half, and chop those halves in half, until everything is chopped to a size and shape that the game engine is comfortable with. And all of these chopped sectors have a corresponding node on the data tree. In-game, when you walk into this room, you enter this sector. That sector matches this node. The processor travels down the tree to this node and draws everything visible to the player within it, and remembers how much of the screen that took up. It then hops to the node closest to this one, and draws everything visible within it, and remembers how much of the screen that took up, and moves on to the next closest node, and the next closest node, and the next closest node, and realizes that everything in this node is being obscured, so it doesn't draw anything, and moves on to the next closest node, and the next closest node, until it's sure that every pixel in your field of view has been drawn. Why does it do this like this, and why does that work like that? Well, that's a very complicated question, and I'm gonna have to simplify, but sectors that are closer together are oftentimes going to have walls that obscure sectors that are farther away. And so you draw the closest ones first. If the processor drew this wall way back here, it would have to draw over it later and waste valuable processing time. As I touched on earlier, processors weren't powerful enough to handle drawing entire rooms, so you had to figure out solutions to this to ensure that the processor was only drawing what was absolutely necessary. So even though this seems complicated, it's a solution that's very easy on the processor, and it's an arguably better solution than the one that Wolfenstein used. Why? Well, Wolfenstein was married to its 2D setup. Every wall in Wolfenstein had to be the same exact height, because every column on screen was really just a representation of a pixel on this top-down map. This solution doesn't allow for variable wall size. Also, every wall in Wolfenstein had to be at right angles to one another due to this system. Everything was boxy because calculating walls at any other angle would be tough on the processor and slow down the game drastically. Doom, since it's not using raycasting and went with an entirely new system, was freed from these limitations. Walls can be different sizes since, instead of drawing vertical columns that represent pixels, the processor is hopping up and down a data tree and drawing different sectors. And because of this, you can apply different floor and ceiling heights to these sectors to create a variety of different room types without bogging down the processor. It's brilliant, it's sophisticated, but it's not actually 3D. These different floor and ceiling heights are just numbers in memory that tell the processor to draw something farther up or down the screen than it normally would. In memory, the processor is just thinking of everything as being in a 2D plane, but drawing it in such a way that it looks like it's calculating three-dimensional space. If it were actually calculating three-dimensional space, you would be able to stack rooms on top of one another, but you can't in Doom. Play all the way through Doom 1, and you'll never find a room that's actually stacked over another room, because that would mess with the top-down map that the processor is actually working with. This is also why, as I mentioned earlier, you can hit demons that are clearly above or below your line of fire, because they're not actually above or below you as far as the processor is concerned. They're just drawn at certain points on the screen to give you that illusion. This is also why you can't look up or down in the original Doom. This isn't a quirky game design choice. It's because it's actually just a 2D game that's faking 3D really, really hard. It wasn't until Quake came along that we got a true 3D game from id Software. You could look up and down. You could have rooms that were over top of other rooms. The entire 3D map in memory was being processed as a truly 3D environment. It has stairs! So get this, their breakout hit game, Wolfenstein 3D, was released almost half a decade before their first actual 3D game. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Wolfenstein 3D or Doom are lesser games because of this. All of that stuff at the beginning about id Software lying and cheating, that was just me poking fun. If anything, this type of programming wizardry that fakes 3D is truly impressive, and the guys at id Software were geniuses. Binary space partitioning had been written about since the late 1960s, but it was John Carmack, the lead programmer at id, who implemented these ideas in Doom, and as a result, revolutionized gaming. And that's arguably not the most important thing he's done. The guy was given 2 Emmys for his work in computer technology, and he's spearheading Oculus today, which is no small task. I find it truly amazing that Doom and Wolfenstein 3D look like any other 3D game, even though, under the hood, they're both being computed exactly the same way as 2D top-down shooters are. And it's because of this that they were able to become so popular. This fake 3D was easy on processors, so you didn't need to go out and buy a beast supercomputer to run these games. Almost anybody could get a copy of Wolfenstein 3D or Doom and play it, and even so, these games still looked phenomenal at the time. time. Understanding how games are programmed and what's going on underneath the hood can give you insight into why certain design choices are being made, and being aware of a game's technological limitations can serve to heighten your respect for its designers and help you appreciate all the cool tricks and workarounds they had to do to make their game work. And it can also help contextualize games like Doom and Wolfenstein and explain why they were considered so revolutionary in their time. And clever cheats and workarounds like this are still being used today. Games are lying to you all the time. Developers still have to dance and design around limitations in order to give us the beautiful worlds and elegant mechanics we're so used to exploring. So the next time you sit down and play a game, give a little nod to the developers, who put in so much effort to make these playable worlds work. Hey guys, Ronnie Edwards here.
What's up with your face?
Oh, you're probably noticing how I'm drawn with less stubble this time around. It's because Dollar Shave Club paid for this video. And your drawings too will have less stubble if you get one of these razors. No, but for real, I've actually used one of these razors in real life well before they even paid for this episode. A year ago, they sponsored an episode of Game Theory that I edited, and I needed to purchase one of their razors out of pocket just so I could capture high-quality screenshots of their purchase page to use during that sponsored segment. And so I just got their cheapest two-bladed razor, and it actually ended up being one of the best razors I'd ever used. They're not asking me to say this. This is actually a true story and a neat piece of game theory trivia. They are, however, asking me to say, go to dollarshaveclub.com/DNSQ. That's dollarshaveclub.com/DNSQ.
Pro tip!
You don't have to pay every single month. My hair doesn't grow that fast and I don't shave every single day, so a single packet of razors lasts me longer than a month. If you're like me, you can just pause your subscription periodically and then resume when you do start running low. They're not asking me to say this either. This is a serious pro tip coming off the top of my head right now. Seriously, try it. I actually do dig their razors and they paid for this episode, so without them, you wouldn't have this episode. Also, if you buy one of these razors and find that they aren't shaving like at all, then you've inserted the blade upside down. I may or may not know this from personal experience.